Longing for light, we wait in darkness. Longing for truth, we turn to you. Make us your own, your holy people, light for the world to see.
There are three questions which raise the question about are we sort of bending over backwards? Are we in some way diluting our Catholic faith in being interested and accommodating to people of other religions? And one questioner points out that there was a document of the 1990s called Dominus Jesus, which took a very strong position more or less about the importance of the one Catholic faith and that this was superior to others and so on like that. And what I would simply remark is go back to my remark yesterday of the difficulty of my own brothers in the council in Rome with this very topic. And as I put it out to you yesterday, it was only when all of us came together to Sri Lanka for 10 days that the question really didn't disappear. It's rather the experience of other religious groups and the goodness and the kind of search that they're in was so different that the writing of our own document for our own congregation on interreligious dialogue was made much easier. So there's always going to be a tension, and I think that tension is manifested sometimes in the silencing of people, Jesuit, Jacques Dupuy, difficulty of Tissa Dallaserias, who some of you would have known. But ultimately these things were solved. Friends in England would say to me, it doesn't matter which government rules, the civil service runs the country. And the Vatican Curia is a civil service, not a clerical service, largely. And it has people who are for or against. And I in no way doubt the sincerity of people in that way. Possibly the very fact that there are such tensions is that it's a sign of life. There's not one great uniform policy as would have come down during the communist bloc. Second kind of question that comes up is the question of pluralism and living with pluralism. And as this is the concluding part of this morning's presentation, I'll simply mention that that's where I would hope to address it best. I'm very grateful to the panel here yesterday for the wonderful insight that I felt I had by the time I heard you talking about your concerns and how you felt the schools in Singapore could be better. And three questions have come to me saying, well, this is not the word they use, it's the word I use. What is the critical mass? How many people do you need to make it a good Catholic school? The questioner asks, can you have a Catholic school with a non-Catholic principal and with the majority of the staff non-Catholic? That's the question which there's no answer. But I'm going to try and answer it this way. My experience of working for many years now with the training of lay people to take over the leadership of brother schools in various parts of the world shows me that the direction to follow is not spending time playing harps and lamenting over the absence of the religious, but rather, as one of your speakers yesterday said, it's the training of the lay people. Perhaps we forget that it's only in the 1980s, in 1987 actually, in the document which we call Lay People Faithful to Christ, that we really get the strongest affirmation of the role of the laity since the time of the Vatican Council itself. And this means lay people, training lay people, for beginning in 1990 in my own country country, we began training lay teachers in our Catholic schools, and we've trained, I think, over 3,000 altogether. People, when we say training, these have been in programs that we've run. Perhaps the proof that they were successful is how many people we trained for our own schools who were then taken by the local archdiocese to head other Catholic schools. So something is happening in this regard. So the training of the laity, I'm going to come to in a moment in another form of the presentation. But I think that's a very, very important point. And I think with regard to controversy in the church, there's always been controversy in the church. If you think about the Acts of the Apostles, Paul comes to the Roman family and meets Peter. And the first thing they do is argue. Because Peter's not too sure about admitting these people who are not Jews into the church. But Paul is very convinced. And he said, I argue with him. And I can imagine Paul shaking his fist at him. But so controversy is a sign of life. Uniformity, I think, sometimes reminds me, of 1984, or the communist state, where there's only one party and it can only do good because it's the one party. It wins all the elections because it's the best party, because it's the only party. I don't think the Church of God is ever going to be like that. I think when saints can disagree, and when teaching can develop. Perhaps the greatest insight of the Second Vatican Council came through a strange kind of paradox. There were a number of theologians in the 1950s who were looking at this whole aspect of what do you do after a Second World War? What do you do after the Holocaust? How do you actually come back and proclaim religious truth in these matters? And some of you know the name of Yves Congar, a great Dominican writer. And he was pointing in this direction, particularly the role of the lay people in the church. And his head of his order in Rome was told in Rome, by Rome, that he was to be silenced. He was not to preach. So they sent him to England. He was a Frenchman. He actually spoke English, but he wasn't to preach. While he was in the Dominican house in Cambridge, he was going along the shelves one day, and he saw a book by somebody called John Henry Newman, a person we know as Cardinal Newman, an Anglican, who wrote a book called The Development of Doctrine. The Development of Doctrine. So it's not static, it develops. Congar was brought to the Council, the Vatican Council, and Newman's thought on developing doctrine came through an exiled Dominican priest in England. One of those wonderful paradoxes of life. Congar accepted to be silenced, and yet in God's time, Congar was the one who brought that development of doctrine from an Anglican who later was to become a Catholic. So I think in this sense, we always have to await the time of God's mercy and God's understanding. There will be difficulties, but I think to hold the line, and from my viewpoint, and as Friar Michael pointed out yesterday quite correctly, I've quite deliberately followed a whole series of documents of Catholic teaching which are within our official documents. Sadly, many of these documents haven't reached us in the homilies, in parishes and things like that. But these are the things that our church is affirming. And it's on that line that I'd like to continue with the work that we began yesterday. So we're going to talk about Catholic education as a ministry of the church. We'll just take a moment on the word ministry. Who are ministers in the church? Oh, the priests. Sorry. They are responsible for the sacred ministry of the church. Who are the ministers in the church? All of us. Are there some official ministers in the church, recognized by the church? Yes. in the Synod of 1987, which was on lay people. Eventually, the document comes out and talks about the ministry of those who teach, welfare ministers. The ministry of those who work with the sick. The ministry of those who care for the suffering. And in this sense, it's the word that we would have had in perhaps many of us in first hearing the parable of the Good Samaritan, who pours in the oil and the wine and ministers to him. He helps this poor man, Samaritan, to be brought back to life, brought back to health. And in that sense, there's a very clear, I think, direction in which the Church has taken. And that's why I pick up again from your panel yesterday the importance of someone talking about the training of lay people, the training of all of us. And that's something I'll come back to as we go on. So, what is this ministry? Well, first of all, let's begin with the idea of faith and beliefs. Faith itself, traditionally in the Church, has the Latin tag, Donum Dei, as we see here in English translation from Ephesians 8. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, for it is a gift of God. The mystery, which has always been here since the beginning of Christianity, perhaps since the beginning of time, is particularly looking from a Christian viewpoint, there is why do some people get the gift of faith and why don't some others? Is there going to be a day when the whole world is converted and become Catholic? Not on any projection so far that I can see. And so we're going to live in this in-between time. And those who have the gift, in some way, as in the parable of the talents, are called to share it. They're called to proclaim it, as we saw yesterday, through the witness of their own lives. And we know that this is one of the major ways in which a lot of people come, for example, through the RCIA programs and other kind of programs, to eventually affirm something which they were not born into. In this sense, then, it's very important for us to distinguish between faith and beliefs. And beliefs are a very, very slippery kind of word. You might believe that Manchester United will win the next premiership in the soccer in England. Or you may not believe that. It doesn't really matter, does it? It's like somebody saying to you, do you believe in baptism? Believe in it? I've even seen it done. You see how slippery the word is? We all have beliefs. But the beliefs we're talking about here in terms of faith are those things which the Church had said, these are matters of faith. These are the kind of things that we say in our creed. Perhaps better understood when we simply say it in the simple form of the Apostles' Creed. What are these things? They're about God, who is Father and Creator. They're about Jesus, His Son, who is sent as Redeemer. They're about the Holy Spirit, who comes to enlighten us all. It's about the Church, which the Holy Spirit has helped to found, and the Church which then remains, as it were, the old term would be the Ark of Salvation, the depository of faith, helping others. But so in believing then in final things, in death and judgment, resurrection, and all these other things, it's part of a belief system, but it comes to us through the gift of faith. I personally regret that in the recent retranslation of the Creed, we've moved away from the we believe, which was in the Church long before the Latin began. It was said in Greek, we believe. I can sometimes, I'm sure many of us on Sunday morning, when perhaps we're only half awake, when you stand and affirm your faith, I like to think I'm with a lot of other people whose faith may be stronger than mine is at that hour in the morning. Anyhow, we've moved back to I believe, and yet I think in some ways have we lost this thing that faith is affirmed in a community. Yes, I must have said something heretical and something so we'll go on. So when we talk about faith, as we were reminded yesterday, very so strongly and strikingly by the Archbishop, faith in whom? Faith in Jesus Christ. Faith in God. Faith in what? Faith in the teaching of the church. Faith in the gift that we've received. And these things are affirmed. Is our faith always 100%? Well, mine isn't. But it's something we strive for. It's interesting when you take the three great virtues, faith, hope and charity. There are certainly times when our hope isn't particularly good. Perhaps, on Monday morning when school starts again. Charity sometimes when that boy who's been mucking up is mucking up again. Faith, hope and charity are wonderful virtues we try and practice, but we're striving always towards their perfection. And that's why it's good to stand with a group of people in church and affirm our faith together. It's what we believe as a community. And as we go into this, it's interesting that Karl Rahner, the great theologian, Jesuit, reminds us that conversion to faith is always a process with many stages, which we'll be looking at in a moment. And these need not necessarily follow the same process in every individual. Faith is never awakened purely from outside, addressed solely to naked understanding as such. In other words, it's like a mathematical, oh, I see, yes, okay. Oh, now that equation balances. No, it's not like that. To lead to faith is always to assist understanding of what has already been experienced in the depth of human reality as grace. In the history of religions generally, the only dynamic principle is that of experience. And if you were to follow, for example, the history of Hinduism through the Vedic scriptures, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, down to the present research of the Brahmins, you see a refining of belief through experience. Why does Buddha emerge at a certain time in the history? Why does Buddha's teaching eventually move into different forms? Why does the Hinayana Buddhism merge into Mahayana? Why does that move again into a form of Zen Buddhism? Experience. Something becomes more important. Why does the history of Christianity change at different times? It changes because of a Luther, because of a person whose experience of the church, and of a very corrupt church at the time, leads him into what becomes a revolt. How often we read theologians today saying, if we'd listened to Luther, instead of condemning him, we might never have gone through that break in the church. Well, we can always regret, but once it's broken, it's broken. Experience then, the experience of the church itself, because the doctrine develops. If in our more secluded, if you're almost like ghetto kind of existence as church in many countries following the Reformation, the persecutions in Ireland and in England and many other countries, if the church existed like that for a long time, nevertheless, that's not where we're invited to be today. It's where that doctrine, the idea of safeguarding and keeping apart from, now we're being called, as that document from Pope Paul VI pointed out, we're in dialogue with the world. We have a message to offer. But it's not a one-way process. It's a process of giving something and listening. And this is very important in this whole understanding of grace. Grace, faith, donum Dei, gift of God, it's a mystery. As I said yesterday, we enter into the mystery, and it's only from within in some way we get some apprehension, some understanding of what this calls us to. And this is always going to be the way for us. Now, it's very important to think of us now in terms of ourselves. Some of us here are teaching in kindergartens and primaries and so on like this, and all of us began life at a certain stage, or many of us, with a childhood faith. Others of us came to faith as young adults or perhaps older adults. And what do we know about faith as it develops? been a lot of writing on faith since the mid-60s, 1970s, in the last millennium. And I'm going to look at three speakers in particular. James Fowler, a Methodist minister, John H. Westerhoff III, who I think had a kind of, I think his main background was Baptist, and Baron von Hugel, even though the name is German, he's German born, he lived and worked in Cambridge in England. And then all these people talk about what childhood faith is like. And Fowler would say it's intuitive. The child accompanies his parents to church. He sees what the parents do. It's projective in the sense of you're there, you're asked to sing or do something or make some gesture, stand up, make the sign of the cross. In that sense, it's mythical and literal. It's a story. And we'd often think, I think of myself as a child, looking at Schuster's Bible history, where God is depicted as an old man with a white beard looking out of heaven creating earth. I think I've moved on about God since then. Not sure he hasn't yet, actually. But so there's this idea of childhood faith. Westerhoff would say, look, faith initially is simply experienced, and it's affiliative. In other words, it's part of what children do. They obey their parents. They do what the parents do. They accompany them, they learn it through doing and following what's there, and just take it for granted. On Sunday morning, for example, we go to Mass. And von Hugel was writing in the late 19th century would say, well, it's institutional. You're part of a particular faith community, and in that institution you learn certain ways of believing. Does our faith then grow? Well, I hope it does. Because this is really what's called socialization into religion. Does this condemn it? No, not at all. We learn from others, just as we learn to speak by listening, just as we learn many things growing up as children from our parents and from other children. So we're socialized into religion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we accept it as we grow older. And those of you who are teaching now in secondary schools, and so many of you here with children and adolescent children, know that it's not always like that with them. So the same three speakers would talk about. Fowler would talk about a faith which is synthetic, which is synthesis. It's something they've come to learn to do, to take part in. It's conventional, everybody does it that way. But in adolescence it moves to something which is more, not just individual, it coins the word individuative, meaning you begin to think about it in terms of, well, what do I actually believe this? Do I actually want to go along with this? Do I want to go to Mass on Sunday? It's reflexive. I know so-and-so doesn't go to Mass, yet he was in the same class as I was, and he was, baptized, he was confirmed. Why is he not going, and why am I going? The whole adolescent, the growth into becoming who you are. Westerhoff sees the same way as the movement from the affiliative, obeying your parents, doing what they do, to searching. What's all this about? Why are they doing that? I find it very boring. Very favourite word. When I was studying in Europe in the 70s was the main word you heard in English, or the same kind of word in French anyhow. It was what's all this about? What are these adults doing? I don't feel very part of this. It doesn't go very well, with some of the rock bands I go to. Von Hugel would say it's a movement from the institutional thing where you don't perhaps nearly really confronted it to a critical thing. You begin to think about it. What is this? Why is it? Why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? Why is it this church? Why isn't it this other church? They sing much better in this other church. I prefer going there. And I think this is such an important thing, and I'm not telling you, secondary school teachers or parents, anything you don't know already. But it's a critical searching thing leading towards self-independence. And if we think deeply about our children, we want them to be independent. We know we won't always be there for them. We want them to be independent, to be able to stand by themselves. And I find this a very particular way of C.D. Lewis, a writer, poet, etc., we know him better, probably many of us, through his son Sean, the actor, man who played the great part of Lincoln in that recent film, which he won the Academy Awards and so on. And Lewis has a magnificent poem which concludes with these words: selfhood begins with a walking away, and love is proved in the letting go. And the verse out of which that comes is like this. I'm sorry to stay back for a moment. Lewis has come to place his son in a boarding school, something probably some of you here as parents have done. And perhaps even you think about the first time you put them in kindergarten, and you're trying not to cry, and the child is being very, etc., etc. And Lewis, putting the boy into a prep school, sees him, puts him there, and then he walks away. There's a whole cluster of boys going away in this other direction. And he says this: I have had worse partings, but none that so gnaws at my mind still. Perhaps it is roughly saying what God alone could perfectly show: how selfhood begins with a walking away, and love is proved in the letting go. I'd like you to take a minute or two to talk about that with people next to you. What's it mean for you? Okay, let's see if we can just push it a little bit further. We've probably been talking about these things anyhow. Adolescent rebellion. The day when your son or your daughter says, I don't want to get a Mass today. There would have been a time, certainly in my lifetime, when you would have heard possibly from the pulpit, it's a mortal sin not to go to Mass. We're going to go to hell if you don't go to Mass. Fear, you see, is a dreadful thing in that sense. If you think about it objectively, what a dreadful way to approach the idea of this gift of God, this invitation of God to believe. And as though if we all feared and trembling, everything would be all right. One of the great thinkers of the 19th century, Kierkegaard, has a quotation which I've always found very important. And he said, just as important as the truth, and even more important than the truth, is the way in which truth is received. It would not therefore be much of an achievement to lead millions of people to the truth if by the very way in which they were led, they found themselves outside of it. They were forced to believe, forced to do this under compulsion. Donum Dei, gift of God. That's what faith's about. So the whole selfhood begins with a walking away on the part of the young person. But we as parents and teachers and older people have to admit also that we don't tie that young person then, as we'd say to our ex, in the mother's apron strings. We also have to let them go. Let them go and forget about them? No. Let them go to become that independent, convinced person we want them all to become. But not the person simply tied, as it were, into some kind of childhood faith or something that's routine. Painful? Yes. Difficult? What we call, churches call traditionally lapsing? Yes. And yet, the gift of faith is there. Let's move to then, what about ourselves as adults? Fowler says our adult faith is paradoxical. It has to balance things. I love the church, but I hate Father so-and-so. I don't really like the way he rants on Sundays, so now I've got a car, we're going to go to another parish. Okay? Well, it sometimes happens, and not in Sydney, but elsewhere it does. So, he says it's consolidated. Yes, as you get older, certain things become clearer to you. The gift of wisdom comes slowly sometimes. Sometimes not at all. Well, it appears not in some people, but anyhow. But it's also universalising. You realise you're part of something much bigger than yourself and your own family, than your own church. And I think that sense, why do people then go to pilgrimage to Lourdes or pilgrimages to Rome or La Salle pilgrimages or Montfort pilgrimages? It's because you're part of something bigger than this. And it's something that there's always something more to need to know. Westerhoff would say it's your own faith. It's self-directed. You've come to this position now, and you hold it firmly as an adult. But you don't quite need, excuse me, you don't quite need to be told you have to do this and you must do that. I've had the experience in Australia as a young brother when we had a Labour Party which was very, very strong and Catholic founded, but there was a split in it. They split into two groups, and because they thought that the Labour Party itself was too close to the communists, and so from the pulpit we were being told when the election came up, you must not vote for the Labour Party, it's a mortal sin. Well, in my community there was a brother who had served during the war as a soldier, and he belonged to the Labour Party. At least he'd served in the Labour Party as a young man. So when the sermon was over, he went into the sacristy and waited for Father. And he told Father, he said, Father, you have no right to say that. Well, brother, I'm in charge here. You have no right to say that. And a nice ding-dong took place with the priest finally going off to the presbytery. But anyhow, so faith in that sense is owned or self-directed. I've had the privilege of meeting and dining with Pope John Paul II, but I don't like a lot of things he did in the church. When I say that he did, that came up during his time. But who am I to say that? Well, that's what I believe in, trying to see different things in the church and so on like that. Notice how von Hugel sees this as mystical, not in mysterious, not mysterious, mystical, something beyond the conventional, ordinary way of seeing things. It's a kind of inner consciousness. You know what you believe in. I once heard a mother at the time of the encyclical, Humanae Vitae and contraception. I heard a mother of 8 children say, what's all this fuss about? And I said, well, the Pope is saying, that. I said, I think he's wrong, she said. She said, nobody should have children unless they're going to look after them. Well, there's the wisdom of experience, and so on like that. Anyhow, what is it? How will we characterise then this adult faith? Well, it's a dynamic, it's a journey of faith. It's not something that, all right, you get to this point, now you're there, now you're cocooned, and it will never change. It changes because your life is confronted by things, by death, suffering, unexpected illnesses, all kinds of things. And this has happened at many, many different times in history. And it happens made through natural events, tsunamis, people of Syria today. And in that sense, the journey is always going on in spite of difficulties. There's a fidelity which has to be lived out through persecution and suffering, as it has many times in the history of Christianity and the history of other religions. I want to come now to what I think is a very important work of Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas is a famous Catholic anthropologist, or never put another way. She's an anthropologist who happens to be a Catholic. As she says of herself in one of her very first writings, I'm bog Irish. She actually was born in Italy, but the parents came from England and Ireland. And her anthropological work was done in Africa. And her question was, why do some communities succeed and why don't others succeed? And this research became very interesting because basically what she expressed in her book Natural Symbols was what she called the interrelated concepts of group. This is an individual's social position as inside or outside a bounded social group. And what she calls grid. An individual's social role is within networks of social privileges, claims and obligations. Now, all that's very abstract, but you have in your folder now, I think, a printout of this particular diagram. I'm going to construct it though, but because I know the words in some places are very tiny, you may follow it some of you may follow it from the screen, others may follow it better from your folder. But let's go back to a basic idea. Grid. Grid are rules, beliefs, practices, and shared social expectations. And the further you go in the diagram in that upward direction, the stronger these things are. Okay, that's the vertical dimension, the grid. She talks also about group. And this is the horizontal dimension, and it means belonging to a community with order and balance. And the idea of the diagram is this, that the further you go in that direction, right out off the graph, the stronger is the sense of community. And the further you go in that direction, etc., on the grid, the more you have people who hold the same beliefs and are strong in those ideas, etc., and live as a community. Now she does the whole thing, though, as a complete grid. So let's build it. So there's the group again, and as far as we can go to the right, there's going to be a strong community. It's going to have things like loyalty and conformity. Some of those articles you can read, why I'm still a Catholic, and why I'm not still a Catholic, etc. You also have order and stability in a sense of belonging, or perhaps a community. In the same quadrant, the grid expresses it's strong, and there are rules, there's guidance, as we get in a church, and expectations. If you're this, then you do this, as a member of this grid. As you go around the quadrants, though, you see, if it's strong, if the grid going vertically is always strong, and if the group going horizontally to the right is always strong and community-oriented, what happens when you get into the left-hand quadrant? Well, your community now is disappearing. Self is the centre. And there's competition and status to get on top. And dog eat dog. Doesn't matter what happens, you're going to be the one on top. Now, do you have strong ideas about this? Yes, the kind of person does. But these ideas are self-centered and selfish. And I suppose dictators in world history have been like bee people. And the sad thing is, as the sense of community declines, it's almost inevitable that these people are suspicious. I suppose the best example we've had in modern history would be Stalin. Anybody whom he suspected in any way of not exactly being on the same set of ideas as he had was simply sent to Siberia to be exterminated. And we've had Pol Pot, we've had some other great dead and dangerous people, we've held the attempted extermination of the Jews as well. So, when we come down to the next quadrant, the C quadrant, notice now that we've gone a long way away from the vertical, we're now going all the way down, and there are no things that people agree with. And there's no sense of community. So here you get isolated individuals with no support, or fixed roles, and secularist horizons, don't believe in anything. And Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, calls this anomie, place of anonymity. You don't exist. I always found it interesting that when supermarkets came into being, initially the people who worked at them sat there and did their work. Then at a certain stage somebody said, I will give them names. Thank goodness they did. In other words, before that, they were simply doing what a machine could do. And of course, as you probably know, now and more, even in supermarkets, we're doing the whole thing ourselves. So this sense of, well, you don't exist. You don't matter. You don't believe anything. Sadly, our world seems to show us a lot of people like this, people who are lost. I'm not just thinking of derelicts and drunks, I'm thinking of people who have no reason to stay alive. I'm thinking about the whole reason, why do we have so much throughout the world today, youth suicide? What a sad thing this is. People with no sense of belonging, no sense of knowing what they believe in or want to do, not wanting to continue to live. That famous song of years ago, what was it? Shut down the world and want to get off. Okay. Right, the diagram continues then into the D quadrant. Now here you don't have much grid either. Well, you have a limited grid. And you have a strong sense of community. But now it's all about everybody being exactly the same and nobody else can be divergent. It's fundamentalist. There are insiders, and those who are inside, they're in the sect, and the others are outside. And we've seen in our own lifetime, well, since I remember 1998, a study done in the Vatican showed there were over 400 different sects in Europe. We know that sects recruit people. They often recruit the young. And they often hold them, and usually, so many of the sects then work out ways of making sure that they sign over any money or any future they have. And then you have people dropping out of these sects and telling them. And we've got all kinds of groups in the world nowadays, who are sort of purporting to be churches and are not allowed to be churches, etc., but who really are self-seeking in this way. Now, what does the grid tell us then about faith, about the gift of God? It says the gift of God needs a community. And faith is expressed through a community. And what does this community do? It holds certain core central beliefs about themselves and about other people. And that really is my whole purpose from the very beginning of what I began with yesterday of saying, look, this is what our church has been developing since the time of the Vatican Council. This whole understanding of ourselves as a community and so on like that, but living a mystery whereby some people getting this gift of faith, a minority of people in the world today receive the gift of Catholic faith. Do we then drum out and say, oh, we've got it, we don't matter about the others? No, more and more. We're concerned with God's whole creation. We're concerned also about the different ways in which, through great leaders, the great religions have in their own ways are trying to give meaning and substance to life to millions and millions of people. And what is our church doing? Our church is saying, we are part of that dialogue. We have a gift to offer as well. We're not going to offer it to say, you must do this, and if you don't do this, we'll hit you on the head. What we're saying is, we have a gift. Yes, okay, this is what our gift is about. Would you like to know about it? And in particular, our proclamation, as I said yesterday, is about witnessing. Perhaps in God, the way God's grace works, the way it came to us, the way it's come to so many of you here in this theatre today, it comes in unexpected ways, often through a person, often through an event, where we're suddenly brought up with the reality of life and death, for example. Other things, it may be a war. The famous First World War chaplain, sort of who came back and said, there are no atheists on the front line. Death is too immediate. So it's not to condemn atheists, but I don't mean that in any. I just mean in some ways that this dialogue in itself is a way of sharing not only what we hold true, but also understanding how other people are trying. And there are insights. I wish we had learned so far from Buddhism something about non-violence. See the sort of thing I mean? I think we'd learned something from religions and parts of Hinduism and also Buddhism about the importance of the environment, about ecology, things like this. So please don't think, oh, well, we've got it all, and yes, we'll tolerate ourselves by condescendingly speaking to them. No, they have gifts as well. It's in the dialogue that the gifts are exchanged. And as we're going to move on to say in a moment, it's never about, I'm doing this to make you something else. I'm doing this because I have a gift which is important to me, and I'm sharing it with you. You have a gift as well. Tell me about what your gift is. Okay. So what is this Christian ministry of education? Well, for those of us who were born Catholic, it was initiation through baptism. Or if we became Catholic, it was because we accepted baptism. And what did that baptism do? Well, it brought us then into the church, into the fold of the faith. We could look at this, I won't put this to one side for a moment because it's distracting for us. I think we all know from our teaching that the whole concept of original sin, which came to us down from St. Augustine, was for a long time held as a kind of a truth that was the only way to explain, as it were, why we sometimes do what we don't want to do and why we don't do what we'd like to do, sort of thing that Paul wrestles with in the letter to the Romans. But Augustine, we know, recognises this, just as we all recognise it. Whether original sin in the way he propounded it is exactly what all this is about is something that people would dispute a lot nowadays. Not about the reality of the fact that we don't always do what we'd like to do, but about the reality, though, that the child is born into a form of original sin. You might remember Tisabana Cerese's problem was, he said, how do I say to my Buddhist friends who invited me to see that new baby? Well, yes, it's very nice looking, but really is in original sin. And for that, of course, he was condemned, and for a lot of other things. But anyhow, so this kind of dialogue is so important. We don't lose ourselves in some way. So, initiation through baptism. Growth through the sacraments, provided the sacraments are received. And in some way, I think we're still trying to find in the church what the role of confirmation is. I don't know how you're finding it, but there have been various attempts to sort of say, well, perhaps we should leave it till later. The Greek Church, the Orthodox Church generally, baptism and confirmation at the same time. Traditionally in the European Church, it's been around about 11 or 12 years of age, and many people would think that's too early. The Anglican Church, many places in their boarding schools, has it usually as something that people are invited to do in year 11 or year 12, when they're a bit older. Some would even dispute whether that's old enough. But anyhow, so literally growth through sacraments. What are these sacraments? Obviously, reconciliation and attending Mass, the reception of communion. People who marry, the sacrament of marriage. People marry themselves. They give the sacrament to one another with the church as a witness. We know the gift of ordination for some people. We know the gift of the last anointing and so on like this. So these are how growth takes place, ideally. But the expression and growth of faith takes place within a community. And it's this development of community. I was interested so much yesterday about the way the panel talked about the importance of their parishes and the strengthening of the parishes. In the last of these three documents we've had in recent years, we had the document of Pope Benedict XVI on charity, which was noted worldwide, not just in the church, but as a wonderful document. We then had his document on hope, and now we've had the third document, which obviously he's written certain parts of, and which our new Pope, Francis, has perhaps finished off. It's been published anyhow, and it's called Lumen Fidei, light of faith. The light of faith. And what's it tell us? These then are the four elements which comprise the storehouse of memory which the Church hands down. The profession of faith, the celebration of the sacraments, the path of the Ten Commandments and other church teachings, and prayer. Not just the saying of prayers, but praying. The Church's catechesis instruction has originally been structured around these four elements. The text goes on, then says, it's impossible to believe on our own. No one makes the journey of faith alone. Faith is not simply an individual decision which takes place in the depths of an individual's heart. By its very nature, faith is open to the we of the Church. It always takes place within her communion. We are reminded of this by the dialogical format of the creed used in the baptismal liturgy. In other words, when you bring the child to the font, what do you ask of the Church? Faith. Why do you do this, etc.? Because faith is a way, and many of you would know that that's in the whole tradition of Islam, that's the very word which they use also, way, the journey. It also has to do with the lives of those men and women who, though not believers, nonetheless desire to believe and continue to seek. To the extent that they are sincerely open to love and set out with whatever light they can find, they are already, even without knowing it, on the path leading to faith, or leading towards faith at least. And it goes on. They strive to act as if God existed, at times because they realise how important He is for finding a sure compass for our life in common, or because they experience a desire for light amid darkness, like our beautiful hymn this morning. But also because in perceiving life's grandeur and beauty, they intuit that the presence of God would make it all the more beautiful. It's the person I said, I would love to believe, a person looking for faith. And this beautiful passage, the light of Christ shines as in a mirror upon the face of Christians. Many would remember this wonderful example in 2 Corinthians. Paul uses the same idea. He said, we look into a mirror and we contemplate in that mirror, we contemplate God until we turn into what we contemplate, made in the image and likeness of God. So the light of Christ shines as in a mirror upon the face of Christians. As it spreads, it comes down to us so that we too can share that vision and reflect that light to others. Reflect that light to others. Witness. Faith is passed on by contact from one person to another, just as one candle is lighted from another. Christians in their poverty plant a seed so rich that it becomes a great tree capable of filling the world with its fruit. I cite this from this most recent text we have from the present Holy Father, because there you see, there's the tension. Yes, there are people who say, no, we should be preserving our own faith and not worrying about it. No, but no, our church is saying to us, no, we have a gift. There are other people looking for that gift. How do we radiate that gift to others? That's what dialogue we talked about yesterday is all about. And I think that's a very, very important part of what we do. But I'll move on because I know there will be some time for questions. I want to move on finally now to pluralism. It's a word we use, it's a word I pointed out to you at the beginning of yesterday. We live in a pluralistic society. We live with pluralism. And I think it's important to, what exactly are we talking about? Particularly in the context in which I've been working these last 2 days. This is an article by a young woman theologian from Harvard University, Diana Eck, which I think is probably the best exposition I've come across so far anyhow of what pluralism is all about. So it's Diana Eck you're going to be looking at, not me. She says, first, pluralism is not diversity alone, but the energetic engagement with diversity. Now this is one of these texts you'll receive with all the other slides, I know, after we finish. Diversity can and has meant the creation of religious ghettos. We certainly do that in the Catholic Church. The isolation. With the way in which the Pope created the ghettos for the Jews in Rome. The Spanish did it in other cities like Toledo. Yes, we've known what that's meant. So they're not like us, put them aside. With little traffic between or among them. Today, religious diversity is a given. But pluralism is not a given. It is an achievement. It's something to be achieved. Mere diversity without real encounters, he says, and relationship will yield increasing tensions in our societies. We've already obvious on a world scale with Islam. Already there. So to have any sort of suggestion that you can actually dialogue, and we know the difficulty of this, and many of you here, I've had the same experience myself in Egypt and in Lebanon and in working in Pakistan with Muslim teachers, meeting high-principled, wonderful people who bring their own gifts to their teaching. But we also know that so many Muslims are formed in the madrasas, where basically they learn the Quran off by heart without even knowing what it means, and we get this kind of fundamentalism which will not brook any interference. And this is part of our world as well. So this achievement has yet to be achieved. Secondly, and this is a word that came up in a number of the questions I had, pluralism is not just tolerance, but the act of seeking of understanding across lines of difference. We agree to differ. Tolerance does nothing to remove our ignorance of one another and leaves in place the stereotype. Oh yes, they're all like that. The half-truth, the fears that underlie all patterns of division and violence. In the world in which we live today, our ignorance of one another will be increasingly costly. After 9/11, one of the Jesuit prep schools, that's up to year 8, in Melbourne, rang the local or nearby Muslim school for boys and said, look, we're going to spend Saturday cleaning up the beaches because the summertime coming on, because we live near a beach. We'd like to invite you down, etc. Come and work with us, clean up the beach. All the food will be halal and so on like that. And now they do that, and it's reciprocated each year. Bridges are being built. Young people sometimes wonder what all the fuss is about, why there's differences. Sometimes you have to build, and this is really what Diana Egg's talking about in this. Our ignorance of one another will be increasingly costly. Thirdly, pluralism is not relativism, against which the Archbishop spoke very strongly yesterday. No, it's not pluralism. It's the encounter of different commitments. People have different ideas who are willing to talk to one another. The new paradigm of pluralism does not require us to leave our identities and our commitments behind. We know less Catholic who are engaging Muslims. For pluralism is the encounter of commitments. This is what I believe and hold to, you believe and hold to. I respect what you do, you respect, etc. Perhaps we find some things we could do together, such as Pope John Paul II found, remember, at Assisi. We don't meet together to solve our problems. We meet together because we pray, and we pray each in his own language. It means holding our deepest differences, even our religious differences, not in isolation, but in relationship to one another. I think this may be one of the most important dialogues we're going to have eventually in the Muslim world with regard to the role of women. So I think that courageous young girl in Pakistan who was shot, because she spoke out against the Taliban, because they were trying to suppress women's education. I think it's this kind of dialogue in the churches which perhaps ultimately is going to help eliminate some of these stereotypes we have. But lastly, she says, pluralism is based on dialogue. Well, here's our word again. Pluralism is dialogue and encounter give and take, criticism and self-criticism. I remember Anglican friends saying to me once, it was a stereotype. There's a lot of opposition to Catholicism. When I began teaching in Melbourne in the 1950s, there were still factory signs which said, men wanted, Catholics and Jews need not apply. Yes, that was still there. That had been said during the Depression. And my people would say, oh, Catholics. Catholics pray fast, sing slow, have large families, and vote for the Labour Party. Well, perhaps we've gone a bit, perhaps some things are true still. But it's the give and take, criticism and self-criticism. Dialogue means, and we had this earlier, both speaking and listening, common understanding and real differences. Dialogue does not mean everyone at the table will agree with one another. Pluralism involves the commitment to being at the table. That's where I feel our church is telling us to be at the moment. Document after document, the most recent document of all, be at the table, but with our commitments, not to surrender, but to share gifts with one another. And so we return to where we began. Here's Pope Paul VI in 1975. Above all, the gospel must be proclaimed by witness. Take a Christian or a handful of Christians who in the midst of their own community share their capacity for their sharing of life and destiny with other people, their solidarity with the efforts of all for whatever is noble and good. Let us suppose that in addition they radiate in an altogether simple and unaffected way their faith in values that go beyond current values, and their hope in something that is not seen, that one would not dare to imagine, and their works. Yes, faith and works. Works express our faith. Remember the letter of St. James? Show me your works, and I'll show you your faith. The two things have to go together. And what are these works that you carry out? Feeding the sick, the poor, the whole things you're trying to do to lend, perhaps the whole work you do with people who live alone, and in some of the mansions, some of the high-rise areas here, etc. The three things: the faith, the hope, and the works. And it's interesting that these are the three letters, the three most recent letters that our church has given us. And so that's where we are, and that's what we now stop for.